Welcome to this lecture on sexuality in ancient Egypt. Keep in mind, in a previous lecture, we looked at the concept of gender as a cultural construct. Sexuality, too, is a cultural construct, but it doesn't necessarily have any relationship to gender. And it's important to keep that in mind. Even though historically lots of people have assumed a heterosexual belief about cultures, arising out of there being a male and a female. That is not the case in all places at all times. Though for ancient Egypt, the story is going to feel like that, but we should also keep in mind that the evidence for ancient Egypt is not quite so great when it comes to sexuality. Connected to gender is usually the discussion of sexuality, though we should always be careful not to assume that a gender identity necessarily results or relates to a sexuality, a sexual preference. Though in ancient Egypt, we don't have much evidence for what goes on there. There's no word that we can point to in Egyptian for hetero, homosexual, or bisexuality. That just doesn't exist. And in fact, we have relatively little evidence, direct evidence about sexuality in ancient Egypt because the Egyptians just rarely talked about it. When they did have some rather scandalous things to say. So if you happen to be visiting the museum in Turin, you can see the erotic papyrus. It's between 1292 and 1075 BCE. This papyrus features 12 highly erotic scenes of very beautiful women engaging in certain activities with usually fat, balding men. And so scholars think that this may be satirical, that this may have not been a reflection of realistic attitudes in Egyptian society, but more or less, haha, let's have a laugh about these things. You also do find illustrations sometimes on ostraca, the little pieces of limestone flakes that people pick up and then they doodle on, as well as, write poetry and practice other arts on them. But there's not enough of these for us to have a sense of what Egyptian sexuality was like. We do have poetry, um, lots of metaphors in the poetry, lots of instances of people calling each other sister and brother. So it's not about incest, it's just a metaphorical love poetry kinds of imagery. Lots of references to gardens. Mythologically speaking, perhaps one of the most famous stories involving sexuality in ancient Egypt involves the fight between Horus and Seth. Horus trying to avenge his father Osiris, fighting Seth in a series of battles. They're depicted here: Horus, the falcon-headed god; Seth, the weird, strange animal-headed god. One of the incidents does involve sexuality. And it's really, sexuality is not the center of the incident, but really it's a story about dominance, a story about control, a story about power that happens to feature sexuality. In the story, Seth actually attempts to rape Horus. And Horus rather intelligently manages to catch the seed of the god Seth in his hand, which he tosses in the river, and his mother Isis tells him to cut off the hand. She later restores it. So what we've got here is an attempt at domination. And the attempt at domination would have impregnated Horus with the seed of this other god. Except Horus is too smart for that, and he's not even going to allow it to remain on his body. he will cut off his hand and throw it in the river. Thank goodness he's got a magical mom. Isis tells Horus that what you need to do is put your seed on lettuce and then have Seth have a giant salad. And that's exactly what happens. And it turns out in Egyptian iconography, lettuce is an aphrodisiac. It has a very phallic shape to it. And when cut, it leaks a sort of milky fluid that the Egyptians kind of associated with male seed. So that's what happens, and Seth eats the lettuce, and then later, when Seth is trying to make fun of Horus and say, "Ha ha, I conquered you, I dominated you," Horus says, "Well, let's call forth the seed and see whose seed comes out of whom." And then Seth is incredibly embarrassed when Horus's seed comes out of his body, and Horus has, outsmarted him, has tricked him. So this is a story that's got interesting overtones about sexuality, theme of homosexuality here, but not homosexual love in the sense of this is a relationship, because it's really more about domination than it is about an actual relationship, which may be a clue into Egyptian society, into the ideas of, having someone inseminate you, to put seed inside you, is a sign of being dominated. Do we have evidence for homosexuality in ancient Egypt? Oh, this is really hard to answer. Perhaps one of the most famous and most hotly debated of the cases would be the tomb of Neankhnum and Khnumhotep. This is from the Old Kingdom in about 2500 BCE. Two royal manicurists shown in very, very intimate poses in their tomb, which the poses are really interesting because they're poses normally reserved for, husbands and wives, as archaeologist Greg Reeder has pointed out. And even though we have evidence that both of them had wives and children, the wives and children in the tomb are conspicuously subordinate and not really very physically dominant in the tomb. It seems to be focused on the two of them, which has led some people to argue that, in fact, they are a same-sex couple. Other Egyptologists, for example, like John Baines, has argued that this is a set of twins. They're just, really, really, really close twins. And you can see it in their names. Both are names that relate to the god Num, the potter god. And therefore, this is just a really close familial relationship. Probably we'll never know for sure. We do know that those kinds of relationships existed. One of those an ostracon from Deir el-Medina, does depict men engaged in physical activity. So it happened, but we can't say anything for sure about whether it was an identity, whether these were loving relationships, whether these were long-term, committed, emotional, intimate bonds between two people of the same sex. It's a lot harder to jump from a picture on a wall in a tomb to a full-blown identity in the way we would understand sexuality, especially homosexuality today. So that's been our introduction to ancient Egyptian gender and sexuality. And I look forward to talking with you soon about some unusual and powerful women in Egyptian history. Stay tuned.